What's going on, everyone? It's Adrian from Draft Time, and welcome to another NBA FanDuel picks video. Now, in this video, I'm going to go over tonight's slate for FanDuel, the main slate, which is a six-game slate. So, basically, for this video, I'm going to try to give you a full, comprehensive breakdown of the slate tonight. So, before I get into that, I want to go ahead and take a look at last night's lineups because I had a pretty good night last night, and this was the main lineup right here. You had Andre Drummond, who absolutely crushed in place of Nikola Vucevic. And that's not really surprising. I mean, people forget that Andre Drummond it used to be an all-star and used to put up huge numbers. So that lineup finished 648th out of 26,455. So it actually finished in the top 2.5 percentile, which is pretty good. And I want to show you my best performing lineup of last night. That was this lineup right here. Finished 194th out of 26,455. Um, and with this lineup, all I did was excluded Andrew Nemhard, who I was a little bit on the rocks about. So, anyways, let's go ahead and get into tonight's slate. So for tonight, the big news is there's no Joel Embiid again. He missed the game on Christmas, and also some pretty big injury news and some guys you want to keep an eye on is Luka, Giannis, and Donovan Mitchell are all questionable. So that's going to have a huge impact if any of those guys end up missing the game. So let's go ahead and let's sort this by value to take a look at the top value picks for the slate. And so far, as of right now, there's not a whole lot of value on the slate, but that'll obviously change if any of those guys end up missing the games. So the top value pick that's going to be Julius Randle at 8,500, which is a pretty good price from him. He scored 40 plus in four straight games, and he's actually averaging over 43 over his last 10 games. And he's going up against the Oklahoma City Thunder, who play at the sixth fastest pace out of all the teams in the NBA. So that's why he's popping up in the top value. Then you got OG Anunoby. He's under 6,000, and he's going up against the Wizards, who are the worst team defensively, and they play at the second fastest pace. So you're going to see a few Raptors guys here as the top value picks. Tyrese Maxey, his price has been lowered to 8,400 because he had a pretty bad game on Christmas. Finished with just 29.1. He actually had a really bad shooting game. He finished 4 of 20 on that game on Christmas against the Heat, and that was without Joel Embiid. But I expect him to have a bounce back game with no Joel Embiid. He's going to be the go-to guy, so he's a pretty good value pick. And you got Dennis Schroeder, $6,100. Same reasons as OG Anunoby. He's going up against the Wizards, who are the worst team defensively. So, anyways, those are going to be your top value guys, and there's definitely going to be some other guys that pop up in here if any of those key guys who I talked about earlier end up missing the game. But anyways, let's go ahead and let's take a look at the first game. You got the Raptors at the Wizards. And like I mentioned earlier, Washington's defense is awful. And then you got the Raptors, who are pretty average when it comes to points per game allowed and pace of play. So for the Raptors, you got a few guys here who are popping up with over 5 fantasy points per $1,000. First of all, you got OG Anunobi, and he's only $5,900. And um, he had a good game last game, finished with 33.4. But before that, he was actually on a pretty bad stretch. But now he's kind of bouncing back. Dennis Schroeder, 6,100. That's pretty good value going up against the Wizards. Same thing with Siakam, $8,600 going up against this Wizards team. And even Scotty Barnes at 9,800 is pretty good value going against this Wizards team. And Scotty Barnes is actually on a pretty good stretch. He's coming off a 62.3 point game, and he's averaging 54.58 over his last 5 games. So he's on a hell of a stretch. So what I would do with the Raptors is I would mix and match two different guys from the Raptors, different combinations of two Raptors players. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to pick up Siakam and Scotty Barnes into the same lineup, and I'm also not going to pick up Gary Trent and Dennis Schroeder into the same lineup. So kind of mix and match without getting those combinations of players together. And Gary Trent is actually someone who I kind of like as a sleeper at $4,500, going up against this defense. And if you look, he had a 41 point game on the 18th against the Hornets, who are another bad defense. So he is capable of having another big game like he did against Charlotte, which is why I might consider him as kind of like a sleeper pick tonight in a few lineups. So for Washington, you got Kyle Kuzma under $8,000, which is a good price for him. So he's going to end up in a lot of lineups. And what I may consider fading Kuzma in a few of those because I don't have 100% confidence in him. I mean, if you take a look at his last two games, 22 and 33, I mean, that's not going to cut it. So I am going to fade him in a couple of lineups. Now, Daniel Gafford, $6,600, you have to consider him in a few lineups, especially considering the stretch that he's on right now. He's averaging 41.8 over his last 5 games, and that includes two 55 plus point games. And then his last game, he scored over 48 points. So he's on a really good stretch right now, which is why you have to consider him at that center spot tonight, which is there's not a whole lot of uh, big names tonight at that center spot. And the same kind of applies to Tyus Jones because he's another guy who's on a big stretch right now, averaging 41.38 over his last 5 games, including a 64-point game. So you have to at least consider him in a few lineups tonight. Jordan Poole, I'm not crazy about at $7,000. I'm not a big Jordan Poole guy, but maybe you want to consider him in one or two lineups. I'm not going to do it personally, but just in case he gives you, 45 plus, which he is capable of. But besides these guys, I don't like anyone else at Washington. I think they're all too expensive. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our next game. We got Philly at Orlando. Now, both are pretty good defenses and both play at a pretty average pace. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is a low scoring game. And like I said earlier, the big news is no Joel Embiid tonight. Uh, Maxi, he had that pretty bad game last game on Christmas against the Heat, but I expect him to have a bounce back game. I mean, he shot poorly. I think he's going to shoot better. And with no Joel Embiid, $8,400 is a really good price for Maxi. Now, Tobias at 7,000 might be worth locking into a few lineups, especially with no Joel Embiid, because you never know when Tobias can go off. And he has those random games where he goes off. And he gave you 47 and 56 in his last 2 games. So he's worth considering in a couple of lineups. Now, DeAnthony Melton, he had a good game last game, and he played 36 minutes with no Joel Embiid, finished with 45.9. So you may want to consider some Melton. Now, I'm not going to pick up Melton and Maxi together. I'm only going to do one or the other. Kelly Oubre at 5,900 is a decent price for him with no Joel Embiid. I might pick him up in a few, but I'm not going to go crazy with him. Now, Paul Reed and Mo Bamba are interesting because Paul Reed was in foul trouble last game with no Joel Embiid, and he finished with just 10.9 fantasy points. Meanwhile, Mo Bamba finished with 34.2 points. And now his price is up to 5,700. So with no Joel Embiid, it's going to be worth picking up Paul Reed at 5,300 because he's probably going to get the start. But pay attention. Make sure that they don't end up starting Mo Bamba. And if they do end up starting Mo Bamba, he might be worth considering at $5,700. But besides that, I don't really see anyone else worth picking up on Philly. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at Orlando. Now for Orlando, yesterday, Banchero and Franz Wagner actually had pretty decent games. Banchero finished with 45.6 points, and Franz ended up with 57. So they both had pretty good games last game. But then again, they went against Washington, who are awful defensively. Philly's way better defensively. And at their respective prices, I really don't think they're worth it. I mean, maybe you pick them up. Maybe you pick up Franz Wagner in a few lineups at 7,700, just in case he goes for, 45 plus again. But at $8,700, I don't really think Banchero is worth it. And no one else, I don't think anyone else on the Magic is worth it going against the Sixers, who are a pretty good defensive team. Okay, now let's go ahead and take a look at the next game. You got the Bucks at Brooklyn. You got Giannis, who's questionable. So a lot rides on whether or not Giannis plays tonight. Now, if he does play, you might want to lock him into a couple lineups, just in case he goes for 70 plus, which he's definitely capable of. If he doesn't play, you're going to see a lot of Damian Lillard pop up into a lot of lineups, and rightfully so. He's on a good stretch, even with Giannis, and he's averaging 52.5 over his last 5 games. And if Giannis ends up missing the game tonight, expect his projection to shoot up around 50, which is going to make him pop up into a lot of lineups. Maybe you consider fading Dame in a few lineups. If he scores anything in the 40s, he might not end up in the number one winning lineup. Middleton, I think he's too expensive, even with Giannis. Same applies to Brook Lopez. I mean, maybe you consider Brook Lopez if Giannis ends up missing the game, but I'm not going to have much Brook Lopez. Now, Bobby Portis, at under 6,000, even if Giannis plays, is someone that's worth considering because every now and then Bobby Portis has these random games where he pops off. Uh, Malik Beasley, too expensive. Pat Connaughton, too expensive. Campaign, way too expensive. So let's go ahead and take a look at Brooklyn. Now, for Brooklyn, I really think everyone is too expensive on this team. Maybe you consider Dorian Finney Smith as a sleeper pick at $4,700. He's coming off of back to back to back 20 plus point games. And if Giannis ends up playing, Dorian Finney Smith might have a lot of minutes guarding Giannis. So he might be worth considering as a sleeper pick. Dinwiddie, Claxton, Cam Thomas, Cam Johnson, Dayron Sharp, I think they're too expensive. Mikal Bridges, I think, is too expensive, but he did have that good game last game, or 2 games ago, actually, where he finished with 52.7. Now, granted, that was against Detroit, who was awful. So I'm not too crazy about Bridges, but I'm probably going to lock him into 1 or 2 lineups just in case he gives you 50 plus at $7,500. That would be pretty big. But that takes us to our next game. You got Phoenix at Houston. Now we know that Houston is a good team defensively. They allow the second fewest points, and they also play at a very slow pace. And when it comes to Phoenix, they're very average as far as defense and pace of play. So for Phoenix, if you recall in my last video, which was on the 22nd, there was no Nurkic, and I spoke about Drew Eubanks. And what I said was to potentially fade Drew Eubanks for Chemezi Metu, just in case Eubanks got off to a bad start and ended up not playing that much, and those minutes going to Metu, which didn't end up coming to fruition that game. But the very next game on Christmas, that actually did come to fruition. And if you look, Eubanks only played 17 minutes on Christmas, finished with 13.4 points. And Chemezi Metu, on the other hand, he played 33 and a half minutes and he finished with 51.8, which was, game breaking. I mean, that broke the slate. And at the time, Chemezi Metu was only $4,400. So if you had Chemezi Metu on Christmas, you would have done very, very well for yourself. Me personally, I didn't do that on Christmas. I did that the game before, but I didn't do that on Christmas because I was with my family, celebrating Christmas. And I didn't really do any custom lineups. Basically, I just went with like the top 10 lineups. But, anyways, back to Phoenix. Now, I'm not crazy about any of these guys' prices on Phoenix, especially going up against this Houston defense. I mean, maybe you consider Nurkic at $7,900, just because there's not a whole lot of center options, and he could end up being the top scorer at that center position on the whole slate. So maybe you consider Nurkic. Grayson Allen, maybe you consider him because he had a pretty big game last game against Dallas. Now, I don't expect him to repeat that. So for the most part, I'm not really crazy about anyone on Phoenix. Now for Houston, take a look at Shangun. He scored 65 plus in his last 2 games. So at $8,700, he's definitely worth consideration. Same with Fred VanVleet at $8,500. He's on a pretty big stretch besides 2 games, besides these 2 games right here. But besides that, he's on a pretty decent stretch, including a 71 and a 62-point game on the 18th and on the 20th. So Fred VanVleet is worth picking up in a few lineups. But besides them, I think everyone else is way too expensive. Tari Eason, questionable. Pay attention to whether or not he plays. I don't really think it makes that big of a difference if he misses the game. Maybe you consider a little bit of Jalen Green if Tari Eason misses the game, but no one else really on Phoenix worth picking up. And that takes us to our next game. You got the Knicks at the Thunder, and the Knicks are a very good team defensively, and they play at that slow Tom Thibodeau pace. Meanwhile, the Oklahoma City Thunder are average defensively, but they actually play at the sixth quickest pace out of all the teams in the NBA. So for New York, Randall is on a nice little stretch. He's averaging 43 and a half over his last 10 games. And he'll be pretty highly owned just because he's pretty good value at $8,500. Plus, he's going to give you a high amount of raw points. And whenever you get a guy who's going to give you a good amount of raw points and also has good value, they end up tending to be pretty highly owned. That actually makes him a good candidate for being faded. You could get someone like Siakam for $100 more going up against that horrible Wizards defense. So maybe you fade Randall for someone like Siakam. Now, Jalen Brunson at $8,800, that's pretty expensive, but you still have to consider him, especially considering the stretch that he's on. Uh, he had that 85-point game, and it's coming off a back-to-back 50 plus point game. So you have to consider Brunson in a few lineups. Hartenstein might end up in some lineups at 6,500, projected to score 30 plus, but I'm not going to go too crazy with Hartenstein. I don't really think he has that high of a ceiling. Um, and then Barrett, 6,600. I mean, he's on a pretty poor stretch. Quickly, 5,600, that's too expensive for him. Josh Hart, that's too expensive for him. So, same with DiVincenzo, 5,000, that's too expensive for him. So, no one else worth picking up on the Knicks. Now, for Oklahoma City, you got Shea Gilgeous-Alexander. Now, with uh, Giannis and Luka both questionable, and Donovan Mitchell questionable as well, Shea could very well end up being the top scorer on the entire slate. So he's definitely worth picking up in a few lineups. But besides Shea Gilgis, I really don't see anyone else worth picking up. You got Chet Holmgren, $8,600. I think is too expensive for him, especially when you could get Shangun for $100 more. Jalen Williams, 6,900. That's too expensive. Josh Giddey, 6,100. Too expensive. Dort, 5,400. I think that's too expensive. So no one else really worth picking up on the Thunder, especially against this Tom Thibodeau defense. And that takes us to the final game of the slate. You got Cleveland at Dallas. And for Cleveland, like I mentioned earlier, Donovan Mitchell is questionable. He missed, I think, the last 3 games. So all these guys are priced pretty expensive because they're priced based on not having Donovan Mitchell in the last 3 games. Now, if Mitchell does end up playing, I still think 10,200 is kind of expensive for him. I mean, he would have to score 60 plus to end up to even have a chance of ending up in the number one lineup. So, he's capable of doing that, but I'm not going to go crazy with Donovan Mitchell. If he does end up missing the game, Craig Porter, you might want to consider him, even though his price went up to 5,500. He could give you 30 plus without Donovan Mitchell. And Karis LeVert is questionable. I think even if Donovan Mitchell ends up missing the game, LeVert, if he plays, 6,700 is too expensive. If both of them end up missing the game, maybe you want to consider Max Strus, but I think Max Strus is too expensive. Isaac Okoro is actually interesting because he's playing pretty big minutes. He's played 30 plus minutes in out of the last 5 games. So you might want to consider locking him into a few lineups at under $5,000. Jared Allen at 8,000, I think that's too expensive, even with no Evan Mobley. So, anyways, let's go ahead and take a look at Dallas, which is going to be the last team we look at. And like I mentioned earlier, Luka is questionable. He had a monster game on Christmas. Let's take a look. He finished with over 100 points. So if he does play, obviously you have to lock him into a few lineups just in case he gives you another monster game. Now, if Luka ends up missing the game, I do expect Jaden Hardy to play better than he did the last game that Luka missed, which was on the 22nd against Houston. Now, that game, I remember everyone was all over Jaden Hardy. I think he was like 80% owned. And he only finished with 16 fantasy points in 24 minutes. But that was against Houston, who was a really good team defensively. And that game was a blowout, so he didn't really play that much in the fourth quarter. I don't think he played at all in the fourth quarter. So if Luka does end up missing the game tonight, I do think at $4,400 you have to pick up Jaden Hardy. On the other hand, Tim Hardaway Jr. He actually plays better with Luka. Um, he had 20. He finished with 21 that game without Luka, and then now that Luka back, you see he's back in the 30s again. But either way, I think $6,200 is too expensive. Tim Hardaway, Dante Exum, $7,100. That's way too expensive. Really everyone else is too expensive on the Mavs, with the exception of Derek Lively at $6,100. He's worth considering. Now, before I go, I'm going to run the top lineup just to see what we're working with tonight. And this is obviously going to change, especially with Luka, Donovan Mitchell, and Giannis questionable. So let's go ahead and run this. And we got Tyrese Maxey, Dennis Schroeder, Gary Trent, DeAnthony Melton, OG Anunoby, Kelly Oubre, Kyle Kuzma, Julius Randle, and then Isaiah Hartenstein. Now, this lineup I'm not crazy about for GPPs. You got a lot of negatively correlated players, but I do like it for cash. But anyways, it's going to change regardless. So I wouldn't be too concerned about this lineup. So anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments, and good luck to everyone tonight.